Hey there, folks. Before you dive into this masterpiece of a production, let's set a few things straight. The opinions expressed here are like pineapples on pizza, and not everyone's cup of tea, and that's okay. They belong to the speakers and participants, and not to Witchcraft TV. The video is for entertainment and informational purposes only, because nothing screams fun like a good old disclaimer. Please don't take any of this as professional advice unless your profession is a laugh enthusiast or random fact collector. We can't be held responsible if you attempt anything wild after watching, like starting a llama farm or joining a yodeling competition. Viewer discretion is advised, especially if you're allergic to bad jokes or sarcasm. By watching, you agree that Witchcraft TV is not liable for any shenanigans that may ensue. Now, grab your popcorn and enjoy responsibly. And make sure you keep it right here on Witchcraft TV, www.witchcrafttv.online, where we are fair representation of all pagan, witch, and magic paths.
Hello.
Hey, everybody.
Hi. Merry meet and welcome to our Hex Fest edition here on Witchcraft TV and the Festival Fun Show. Hex Fest is the weekend of witchery, which is an in-person festival in New Orleans, Louisiana, presented by Warlocks Incorporated, Brian Kane and Christian Day, and it runs from August 8th through the 10th in 2025. Hex Fest is all about New Orleans, with ambiance of the Crescent City and the Mississippi Delta. Participants stay in the historic, luxurious Bourbon Orleans Hotel and enjoy such activities as a riverboat cruise and ritual, tours of the historic French Quarter, and plenty of time for shopping. The festival itself has classes and workshops presented by notable witches, root workers, voodoo priests and priestesses, and conjure workers. Register now to attend Hex Fest 2025. Today's guest is one of the presenters from Hex Fest, Houngan Sen Jak. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's like the H is silent, so like Houngan.
Houngan. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Okay, we have some questions for you. So marry me, Houngan Sen Jak.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Festival Fun Show.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. Houngan Sen Jak is from Atlanta, Georgia, and he's going to be presenting 3 classes at Hex Fest in August. He's a psychic reader, a medium, and serves the ancestors and the Loa. Again, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Correct.
All right. As a high priest of Haitian Vodou. Welcome to the show, Houngan Sen Jak. We'll start out with some really basic terms, Voodoo 101, stuff that our audience members don't know. I certainly don't know what all of these terms mean. First of all, what's an Houngan?
So an Houngan is a priest. There's different levels of priesthood, but an Houngan states a priest, a male priest in particular, just like we have the word mambo, which is a priest for a female practitioner. So Houngan, you have Houngan Supuen, which is essentially similar to like a junior high priest. The initiation takes place in Haiti. It's the same, very similar to what the high priest, which is called an Assogwe, goes through. But there's some other things that happen along that journey. And but that's what that phrase means. There's different levels. There's, the initiate of the house, which is referred to as an unsi. Again, spelled with an H, but the H is silent. Unsi is kind of like the first degree of initiation where one has dedicated themselves to learning the service of the Loa, learning how to serve their spirits. learning who the owner of their head is. It's not a priest, but it does make one a member of the societe, the house. And then, it goes to Supuen, and then it goes to Assogwe. Assogwe is the final step. And not everybody goes through all of them. Some people, do go through all of them. I did. I was an Unsi for about a year. That initiation took place, I believe, in 2010, either late 2009 or 2010. And then I was initiated in Haiti for the first time in 2011 to Supuen, where I was, excuse me, I was Supuen for about approximately 7 years. And then it wasn't until 2018 where I initiated again, and that was to the rank of Assogwe, which is, a high priest, essentially. It's the final step.
Thank you. What is a Loa?
The Loa are, essentially means spirit. The Loa are the spirits of Haitian Vodou. Some of them, were living at some point. Some of them were indeed alive, and became elevated to the status of Loa. Some of them, were born spirits. We have many that were born. A lot of them were, and those were like forces of nature in a sense that took on certain human-like characteristics. Definitely not human, but learn to interact with us in ways that we can relate. And some of them were born during certain times in our history. For instance, you have different divisions in Haitian Vodou. You have like the Rada, which are what they call like the cool spirits. Some of these are some of these, the Loa and the Rada nation are, like what I said earlier, were born spirits. You have a lot of raw energy there, very old, spirits of the planet, spirits of humanity, spirits of nature, the forces of nature. And you have, you have Nago, which, are kind of like the warriors. They come from like Yoruba land and those territories. And you see a lot of parallels between those spirits and even certain Orisha because of where they came from, but they're very much different. And you have the Petro, which a lot of the Petro spirits were born during the time of the revolution. They presented themselves during the revolution, which occurred in Haiti, and basically came to the aid of the people there in order to help them fight and free themselves. Petro also consists of a lot of Congo spirits, a lot of, again, like the Rada, very raw, very natural, been here a long, long time. And, you have other nations, that follow that are not as well known, like the Juba, which, we're in the month of that right now. And one of the Loa that's important during this month is Zakamede or Kuzin. He's kind of like the spirit of agriculture, the spirit of farmers. He's the money man. He's the one that keeps us fed, make sure we got all the things we need, help us grow, our wealth and the things that sustain us. And then, of course, you have, which a lot of people usually are drawn to immediately because of the imagery, is the Gede, which took the place of the ancestors for the Haitian people, the people that were brought over through the Middle Passage that became what we know as the Haitians now. They were brought in as a way for them to honor their past, because you had a lot of people that were separated from their homelands, from their families. And so, as people were born, as the new generations came, a lot of who they were and where they come from was lost and forgotten. So the Gede are the ones that, you see in the imagery with, the skeletal figures with the tuxedos and the top hats. You know, and they're a fun bunch. They're very rambunctious. And, you know, aside from, you know, being able to connect to their ancestors through them, they also remind us of our humanity. They remind us of the things that make us human. You know, the things like having fun, drinking, partying, sex, bad language, all those things. They remind us of that part of our humanity. And, you know, so when they come down, they're extremely flamboyant and with those ideas, very exaggerated with those ideas. They drink things that we normally can't drink. They smoke a lot. A lot of their songs are all about sex and dirtiness and, you know, all those parts that coincide, you know, but they remind us not to take life so seriously, you know, and they're also, you know, fierce healers and fierce protectors of children. So a lot of people will associate them with, you know, a lot of dark imagery, but it's just how they look. We all got skeletons underneath us. We're all bones underneath all this. And that's just how they look. That's how they present themselves.
Now, am I correct in assuming that the traditions came from places in Africa, Yoruba and Congo region, and came to Haiti, and then came here to the United States?
Correct. And you know, this is you see this, you know, because you had different tribes, different nations, so to speak, in Africa that were all kind of clumped together, and you know, went to different places. New Orleans has a very strong Congo influence, you know, so that's where we get a lot of the what's become like New Orleans voodoo, Voodoo. You know, the imagery, the mojo bags, the gree bags, a lot of that comes from Congo roots. You know, so depending on, you know, where you're at in this, you know, especially in the South, you're going to have more of an influence from a certain, you know, part that came from Africa. You know, in Haiti, you had almost all of them brought together in one place, and that's how the religion formed. You know, they formed what we call the reglement, which, you know, essentially was a way for them to preserve their past. So they kind of put their heads together and said, all right, how do we preserve our way of life, the what we do know and what we remember, how do we preserve that? And they had to, you know, in a sense, create a system that benefited everybody from all the different places, from the mainland, from the motherland where they came from. So they create a reglement, which is at its base an order of service, an order of spirits that begins with one nation and ends in the other nation. And a lot of those nations were, you know, in a way assigned to different times of the day, the different times of the week. So that way, everybody, you know, was able to honor their people, regardless of where they came from. And, you know, in a nutshell, that's, you know, how the religion formed. It was a way to preserve their past. And, you know, you had Loa the Loa arrived to the island in the heads of the slaves themselves. That's how they traveled. And then, of course, you had some that were even introduced by the missionaries that, you know, decided to basically join the Haitian side. And, you know, they were elevated as such. And some of those Loa, you know, there were Catholic saints that actually are the saint. Most of them are synchronized with Catholic saints in order to hide what they were doing. But there are a few that, you know, were actually those saints and were elevated to the status of the Loa because they decided to join that side.
I had a couple more terms for you to ask about. What is conjure?
So conjure, you know, like root word, like hoodoo, you know, it's called something different depending on, I guess, the region. You know, I was born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Almost all my other family's from New Orleans, but if you're from Louisiana, you're exposed to some of that one way or another. It's hard to not see it. But that system, you know, not necessarily a religion, but it rose, you know, out of a need, for a need to better their situation, to, you know, survive the torments of slavery. A lot of what we see now in conjure and root work didn't look like that back in those days. You know, they didn't have certain things that we use in conjure today. You know, like, for example, I was talking to my god sister the other day, and she's got, you know, some strong roots in some of those families and some of those places where conjure developed, or hoodoo, whatever you want to call it, developed. And, you know, for example, you know, a lot of people are familiar with honey jars or sweetening jars. And, you know, she made a good point. She's like, you know, they didn't have honey. They didn't have access to it. The masters of the plantation did. Honey was a luxury. And so, you know, she made a point, like, you know, if a slave was caught with honey, you know, I mean, God knows what would happen to him. They didn't use stuff like that. They used what they had available. You know, so what they actually probably used was like sugar or pieces of cane sugar, you know, things like that mixed with water. Now we kind of put together a new list of ingredients because, you know, we've got a lot of things available to us. But in the earlier days, that practice came out of a time of need and pain and persecution in order to, you know, make their lives just a little bit more tolerable, a little bit better, a little bit easier. And God knows there's nothing easy about it on any level. But, you know, for instance, like, you hear stories about, you know, conjure being used to be able to work in the house versus the fields. You know, gaining, you know, a better master, so to speak. I hate that word, you know, but, you know, whatever, you know, just to be able to have some kind of a slight, you know, difference in what other people were going through. And so they utilized that to fight the people that were hurting them most, to make their lives, just like I said, slightly a little bit easier, to gain some kind of upper hand on any level. It didn't matter. Any level made a difference back in those days. You know, we can't even imagine what they went through. So any advantage was good. So, you know, conjure was developed as a need, you know, and so, you know, it's important for people that work this to really, they got to work, especially outsiders. We got to really work hard to connect to that source so that that kind of magic will actually work for us. Because, you know, it doesn't work for everybody. It's not just throwing ingredients together and baking a cake. You know, the way I learned it, you know, I mean, a lot of people in Louisiana, we got a lot of different bloodlines, you know, and you never know who a person's ancestry is, you know, ancestors are. You never know. We got Mexican. Louisiana, man, we got a little bit of everything in us. And, you know, for those that try to practice conjure, sometimes it doesn't work. And, you know, I always advise people, you got to connect to those roots. You got to connect to the ancestors of Congo. You got to connect to, you know, you got to, you know, somehow connect to them, because that's the source. A lot of the success of that work comes, well, all of it comes from the ancestors themselves. And a lot of people think that they mean their ancestors, not necessarily. You know, if you got that blood in you, then, you know, it's easier to connect. But, you know, a lot of people got to work hard on making that connection in order for that kind of work to be successful from a conjure standpoint.
Hang on a second. My hubby is bringing me cough drops, or my offspring is bringing me cough drops. So thank you so much.
They're not working okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Thank you for
it's
checking.
not working out.
Okay. Yeah, breathing is important. So hang on just a second here. Okay, I appreciate your explanations of what's going on. So is conjure kind of the work, the magic that is done within the tradition?
It is. I mean, in Haitian Vodou, it's very different. You know, there are some certain elements that are similar, but in Haitian Vodou, you know, we're adopted into that tradition, you know, especially as outsiders. We go through a very rigorous process in order to be accepted. That's why it's not for everyone. You know, Kanzo is about being adopted. you're brought into that family. It becomes family. And, say you leave one house to go to another, you got to go through that whole thing again. Just because you was one and one doesn't mean you're going to be one and the other, because we're talking about family traditions, family lines, and every region is different. Every house is different. So that's why, you leave one family, you want to join another family, just like in real life, you get adopted by them, so you gain access to the Loa, through that process. And then there's always going to be some Loa that just, that aren't for everyone, that, not everybody has the same Loa, not everybody has the same spirits, it all depends. Everyone is very different. Kanzo is not across the board for everybody, and who they serve, and like you Kanzo, then you get to serve this one, this and this one. There are some that are more popular than others that we have to serve in order for the structure to work. But there are going to be some Loa that people never heard about. I mean, I'm discovering Loa all the time that come from the north, that I've never heard of, and they're from that family, they're from that house, and they're not for everybody else. They exist only within that family structure.
Are they kind of equivalent to ancestors?
They absolutely are. They're at the heart of it. They are ancestors, 100%. And some of them, go way back. One of the most well-known images in Haitian Vodou is, of course, the serpent. And where does that come from? Well, one of the places that comes from is from a Loa that we call Dambala. Dambala, there's Dambala Wedo, there's Odan, there's Aida Wedo, there's Agau Wedo, you have all these different Wedos, but Dambala we see in this system as the first ancestor. Dambala owns everybody's head. And the way we see it, you go far back enough, was our original ancestor. That's that serpent. According to Haitian tradition, was the first ancestor. So, Dambala, essentially owns everybody. He's everybody's daddy in a way.
The next question I had for you, the next term, was Sen, like you have in your name. I've seen other voodoo practitioners have that word in their name, and I wondered what it meant.
So usually with that, okay, so Sen is like you have Sen and you have Sin, S-E-N, S-I-N. S-E-N usually denotes like a male saint or male spirit. So it essentially means saint. Now, Sen Jak, is my professional name, so to speak. It's not my spiritual name given to me at Kanzo, during my initiations. It's more of a title that I was allowed to use because Sen Jak Majer is a spirit that's very close to me. So with his permission, I took on that name as a public title, so to speak, but like my spiritual name is very long. It's like a paragraph, So some people do it. Some people just say Houngan and then their first name, or Mambo and their first name. Houngan Billy, my first name. William is my birth name. It just didn't ring to me. And so, my godbrother, / Papa Kanzo, who y'all know as, Hoodoo Sin Moise, he and I had this discussion earlier on when I started doing more stuff in the public, and he's like, what about Houngan Sen Jak? I was like, well, what about it? Who am I to take on that name? I need permission for that. And so I got permission for it. So because that spirit is very, very close to me, has been for a very, very long time, that's the name I take on. I live by him. I live by his word and by his authority and his guidance. And, he's someone that I look up to, that I strive to be more like. So you'll see people use the Sen and the Sin, and not everybody does, but it's a little common, I suppose.
Okay, thank you for explaining all the terms. I very much appreciate this. I have a question that wasn't in the questions I sent. So if I'm way off base here, please let me know. In our tradition, the more of a Celtic from the British Isles tradition, we do a ceremony where we take on the aspects of the gods. It's kind of like Wiccans do invocations, I think the proper word is. And we take on the persona of deities, ancestors, and let them work for us. Is that something that voodoo practitioners do with the law?
Absolutely. I mean, we ask for their intervention all the time. You know, it's it's hard to imagine life, without them intervening, because I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't know what normal is outside of what I do. Um, we do, when you're speaking of like invocation, to me, that's when you call an energy down into you, where you bring them into you in order to, kind of take on some of those qualities in hopes that some of that energy, that residual energy, stays and transforms you. That's, what you're asking is similar to like what I think about, the levels of possession. When the Loa come down, they when they possess us, you know, over time, do they start to leave that residual energy in you? Maybe, maybe not. But I've noticed that a lot of priests, do kind of have some similarities with their main spirits. Sometimes, the spirit that claims you as their child may not have any of the same qualities that you do, but it might be what you need versus what you already have. So a lot of stuff, sometimes people get that confused. They'll see someone like, oh, that's got to be a child of such and such because they're like this and like that. Not always. A lot of times you get what you need in order to become that. If that answers your question.
Yeah, that certainly did. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to kind of move along to your work as a reader. And how do you practice as a reader? Like, explain a little bit about the process.
I do it in different ways. It depends on what, someone is needing. If someone is needing to consult me, about the Loa, or if that's a path for them, the reading is very different. I use, more the Haitian Vodou method, which, in Haitian Vodou, our system of divination was actually lost. It's not like, in Ifa or in Lukumi where you have, a Rumula that's consulted and you have the Dilogun, through the shells, and there's a couple other things that they use for that. The system in Haitian Vodou was lost. The divination was lost. But what happened was, they used what they had, very much like in Conjure. And you see a lot of Voodooizan do readings with regular playing cards because that was something that was accessible to them. So the Loa recognized that as a tool. And different cards have different meanings. The different suits represent different nations, like the nations I was speaking of earlier. But in the end, the Loa can work with just about any form of divination if you give it its due practice, it's due time. Some people use tarot cards, some people use, the playing cards. I use the playing cards whenever I'm consulting the Loa because that's the tool that they're familiar with. And, it works for me, and not everybody's good at it. There's meanings and then there's not meanings, and it's you put them down, you either see it or you don't, but the Loa can help you and assist you in just about any type of divination that you choose. But, we do have our ways that are, like I said, I say traditional, the playing cards are traditional, but, it's traditional not in the sense that goes back to Africa because they weren't using playing cards in Africa. But, in Haiti, that was a tool that was accessible to them. I've seen Houngans and Mambos not use cards at all. They just have a candle there, and they call their spirit, and the spirit possesses them and they allow the spirit to do the reading. That's something that I offer as well to certain people that want, to get the information from the horse's mouth. And then, you have some that just can light that candle and have that person in front of them and just feel and just know, because that spirit is mounted in their head through initiation and speaks and gives them what they need to know. I've seen Ungans use random objects, kind of like, what do they call it? Like similar to bone reading, or lithomancy. Similar where there's different objects that are used. I've seen that in Haiti. I've seen one guy that has this little glass marble about yay big, and he looks to it, he looks at the person and sees all kinds of different things. But a lot of times, they can just sit, and it's like much like mediumship. When I work with the dead, I don't use a tool. I need a glass of water and I need a candle. That's it. Sometimes I don't even need that, but that's the channel. That creates a circuit for me. And then I call on my guides, my dead, the dead that work with that side of us, as acts as kind of like an intermediary to bring those answers. And, without her, I say her because the main one I work with is a she, it would be like me in a room and getting, bottlenecked by millions of people. I got to say, all right, pick 3 people from that entire sea of people that have the most important thing to say to this child in front of me and bring them forward. Everybody else, you got to wait in the waiting room. You got to shut the door. And so I leave it up to her to bring those dead that are forward that have the most important, most beneficial things to say. Otherwise, you got things coming in that just want to live vicariously through the person. And you might be getting messages and telling them to do things that is not for them, but for that dead. That really ain't got no business giving advice. They weren't good at giving advice in life, and they sure as hell not going to be good at giving advice in death. So we rely on our guides to pull those people forward. So that's really how the divination works for me. I do tarot cards. I've been practicing with tarot cards since I was a young teenager. It makes sense to me. I have, when we conzo, we bring certain things into the ceremonial chamber, which is called the jevo, so that it connects to us. It connects to our head, and one of the things I brought was a deck of tarot cards, my deck of tarot cards that I've used for a long time, and my deck of playing cards, so that I can use both. So even if I'm not doing, a reading with the Loa, I still have that tool that connects me to them in that way, so they can still help me interpret. Because I'll look at it, the tarot cards, and what that traditionally means is not necessarily going to mean what I'm seeing and hearing in that moment. So I rely heavily on my spirits and, being the Loa, being the dead, in order to translate that message for me, regardless of what's in front of me.
So this is the kind of like dumb question you ask a rock star, like what's your favorite color? What's your favorite tarot deck?
I love so many of them. I have a ridiculous collection of them, and I think they're beautiful. I really do. One of my favorites is one of my recent favorites is the Heaven and Earth deck. It's very moody. It's kind of misty and dark and kind of dreamy. It's traditional Rider-Waite, but I don't know. There's something about that one I like. I like the Cosmic tarot deck too. I got that one actually at Kirk, or Hoodoo San Luis's shop when he was in New Orleans, when he was still alive. That was a deck that I got. And I like that one because it has a little bit of an 80s vibe to it. And I was born in 76. I love the 80s, and so it has like some of that kind of imagery, and I really like it a lot. There's so many, I have the one that I've used the most is just a standard Rider-Waite. I forget what it's called. It's just a Rider-Waite, but the colors are slightly more vivid, than like the one that has like that plaid kind of pattern in the background. This one is, I forget what it's called, but I've had that one probably the longest. And, you can look at it and tell it's been through it. It's been passed a lot, it's been worked a lot. Oracle decks, I never, got into a whole lot with them. There's a couple that I have that, that I've kind of played with, messed around with, but some of them, sometimes I'll bring it 2 or 3. One of my favorite is the Deviant Moon deck. Those cards just speak. They speak so easily. I enjoy the the artwork on that deck very much. I don't venture too far out, the traditional, I say traditional, the standard Rider-Waite imagery. If it gets too busy or too fluffy or too whatever, I get distracted. I like, cross the board imagery. This is this, Aleister Crowley's the and I never know if I'm saying this right, the Thoth deck, is one that I enjoy too. More so not for doing readings for other people, but more so like for myself. I've enjoyed that deck quite a bit. Let me think, but I have so many. There's one that I saw recently on a reel. I'm like, oh man, here we go, take my money. I love them, and I don't use a lot of them. I'll use them a little bit sometimes, but I enjoy the pictures. I enjoy the artwork. I appreciate, what they are in that form, because there's so many,
Well, you mentioned a little bit about using working with the Loa to do like a consultation for people, like a spiritual consultation. So what exactly does that entail? You said that your lady puts people in the waiting room if they're not really relevant to the question, but can you kind of go through the process?
Sure. So, people that come for what we call a lesan, which is when we consult the Loa. There's usually just a few kind of categories of people. Some of them have had experience with the Loa. Some of them are familiar with that system. Some of them have, Haitian ancestry, and so they're familiar with that. Some people want help directly from them, so they want to know what they say, and is there anyone that will stand for them and offer assistance? One of the reasons why we do that is because we try to offer a solution to whatever the problem is, not just send you on your way, and here's the advice, go figure it out. But they're looking for a solution. A lot of people are looking for an answer and a solution. How can I fix this? So when I do the lesan, a lot of times a Loa will stand up and present themselves, and then offer a solution. Some people want to know, are there any Loa around me? Are there any that are in my vicinity that are paying attention to me? And, I always got questions when it comes to that. It's a common thing, people ask for, an escort reading, meaning like, what Loa walk with me? Well, have you been introduced to them, already? Have you had some interaction with them? If you haven't, well, chances are it's not going to really work out the way you want. Like the Loa aren't just accessible like a lot of people think. We have some that are very close to us as humans that we do all at some level have access to through the proper steps and work. But someone that say coming, from a non-ATR tradition, and just all of a sudden are interested in Haitian Vodou, and they read a little bit about it online, they want to know, oh, well, which Loa walk with me? Let me go try to get a reading. A lot of times, unless you got Haitian or African blood in you, that's not a thing I'm going to do, because how will they know who you are? We are presented to them. We are introduced to them in various ways. Some of that can be through dedication that you've been taking time and you've been doing. Other than that, it happens through ceremony. So sometimes people, don't really get the answer they're looking for. When it comes to like what spirits are walking with me, well, unless you've been introduced to them, unless you've been through a ceremony or you've been through something, the chances are coming out with a big old group of spirits that walk with you is slim to none. Now, people will come asking if this system is right for them. Some people, they got somewhere in their DNA where there's a connection there, where that ancestor that was way back has brought that spirit with them into their life. And that's something I can definitely pick up on. Some people will ask for a reading and know that, can I work in Haitian Vodou, or can I be a member of your house? That's a very good question. That's a question that I get asked a lot. And when that question is posed, there's certain ones that I look for that in my house have to present themselves for that to be a yes, or even a maybe. And then after that, you know, they got to sit in front of such spirit and hear it from the horse's mouth at some point. You know, I can say, you know, yes, you know, your ancestors might need some work. You know, I got some people that are outsiders that want to work with the Loa, and then if they get a reading and then, you know, to see if they can, I'm like, you got to talk to your dead. You got to go to your ancestors, because without that, without their permission, none of this is going to work for you. Like I said, unless you got Haitian blood in you, you got African blood in you, then it's you've got some strong connections and some strong bridges that are there. But, you know, I had a lady one time, and she's been to ceremonies. She's been to voodoo ceremonies. She's met the Loa, and, you know, but she's got some things in her past, you know, because she got slave owners in her ancestry. And so I was like, you got some work to do. You know, you got a lot of things that you need to do, because this is an African traditional religion. And so, you know, without their support, you're not going to get very far. I've seen ceremonies get shut down because the ancestors just said no. You know, and, you know, we can reason and negotiate with a lot of spirits, but the ancestors, really, our blood ancestors, they have all the control. They have all the leverage. And those Loa are not going to step between that. Not only will they not, but in most cases they can't. You know, so it's very important, you know, for someone to have a strong relationship with their dead and to ask permission. Even if they don't necessarily like it, you can say, give me the chance. Allow me to explore this. You know, and a lot of times they'll see really what that service does for them, that ancestral work. They start seeing the offerings and the light and the heat and all the stuff we give them. They're like, oh, now I get it. You know, so they become in favor of it, but sometimes it takes work. I'm not a yes man. I am 100% not a yes man. I don't give a damn. You know, it's either for you or it's not. If there's a bridge that can be built, I'll help you build that bridge. But it's going to take work on your part. And a lot of people want to skip the ancestor stuff and go straight to the Loa. You're going to have some very watered down results if you skip that big important step. You have to have their permission. The ancestors come first. Your blood ancestors must come first.
You got to put in the effort.
Absolutely. It's work.
Right.
You know, people died and they suffered for this tradition, not just so they can be given away to anybody that comes, that just wants it, that likes the pretty altars and want to set it up. You're not going to get a yes out of me.
That would be a good jumping off point to this next question, which is, you teach people how to properly honor the deceased, properly honor the ancestors. What are some ways that folks can do that?
Well, it's important to say that ancestral work that's for everybody. It's your birthright to work with your dead. You know, we have entire religions that are based off of that solely. What I like about it is when someone starts putting forth that effort, they notice that their lives are they get step by step, get a little bit easier. Things just start to kind of move out of the way. You know, a lot of the problems we have can sometimes be our dead living vicariously through us. You know, it happens a lot. So when you give them the things that they need versus taking it within yourself, you can appease a lot of things, a lot of people. You know, and so, you know, when it comes to working with the dead, you know, there's some essential things that we use that connect us. One is water and fire. The other one is fire. Those two things together create this beautiful circuit which connects us to that realm. So those things must be present. Some people include like a cross or, you know, a crucifix or something in the shape of a cross. It's not about the religious symbology of that. It's about the crossroads, you know, and sometimes people will add that to the glass of water. They'll set it in it. They'll set it on top. You know, that also kind of moves on into a different type of tradition, but it is something that some people do to help build that circuit. And it's important to know who your dead are. You know, what are their names? How far back can you go? If you can't go back further than the last 2 generations, that is fine. But it's important for people to do the research, you know, and talk to the elders in their family. You know, that's what I did. I talked to the elders of my family. Who do you know? Who do you remember? Tell me. And I went back as far as I could based off of their knowledge. And then when I hit that stopping point, you know, that's when you do like an ancestor project or a geonome, something that you see what regions they come from. So then you start to think about what foods did they eat? What are some of those traditional things that they ate? You know, because you can talk to, you know what your grandmother probably liked, you know what she cooked, you know what maybe her favorite flowers were, what perfume she wore, what she liked to drink. That's easy. But when it comes to those who are unknown, we don't just dismiss them. We speak the names of those who we know on our mother's side. We speak the names of those who we know on our father's side. And then we show honor and respect to those whose names we don't remember or don't know or that have been lost to us. You do like an ancestry type deal, you're going to know that, okay, I got people from this land, people from this country. All right, so what did they eat? What are some of the traditional things that they ate way back in the day? You learn those things, you learn their songs, you learn their customs and their prayers, and you start incorporating to that just as you would someone that you do know and you know everything about. You know, so it's important to know that. And if you come from an adopted family and you have no clue, again, that's fine. There are ways around that. You know, a little personal story. My father's side is Italian. They're Sicilian. My father was adopted. Okay. He and his brother were found in the swamps of Bayou Sorrel and adopted by the Rizzutos because my grandmother, you know, had trouble with kids of her own. And, you know, she was real close to the governor and the mayor of New Orleans and all that. They, you know, Sicilian families run deep in the South, and all the things that come along with that are part of my family as well. But she adopted those two boys. They were found. My father was feeding my Uncle Johnny, you know, bread and water, soaked in water. You know, they were really young. And, you know, my father didn't know for a long time who his birth parents were. And eventually he did find out. And I got some information from him, and I knew the names. His birth mother was still alive, and I believe she still is. But his father had passed on. But I got the name. Okay, so I got the name. Well, during, you know, my ancestor work, I would hear him, and he was wanting me to call him by a certain name, which, you know, denoted you're, you know, my grandpa or you're my grandfather. I was like, hold up, you got to earn that. You got to earn that right, because my father was abandoned with his brother in the middle of a swamp in Bayou Sorrel, Louisiana. And so I said, you know what? I said, here's the deal. I said, you want me to call you this, refer to you by this title? Then I want to know more about you. I said, I want to learn more about who your past is, who your ancestors are, who you connected to, so that I can work with them and know more about myself. And so come to find out, you know, that man had 28 kids.
Whoa.
Okay. And I connected with two of his eldest daughters, found me on MySpace back in that day. And they grew up with their parents, so they had a lot of information. I said, you know, you connect me to someone, one of your kids. I said, you did all this. But Mr. Father Abraham had many sons. I said, you did all this. You know, I said, this is your doing. I said, so you want me to refer to you by a certain thing? You want me to give you certain things and certain privileges in my service? Then you're going to let me know more about you. So I connected with these two, you know, aunts of mine, long lost aunts. And I learned a lot about him. And that happened in a very short period of time, within a month's period. They found me and just saw my last name. They're like, are we related to you? You know, like, we know that our brother was adopted by a Sicilian family in New Orleans. You know, are you his, you know, Bill's son or whatever? You know, like, yep. And so I learned a lot of things from them. Didn't have any more conversations with them after that. They lived in Bayou Sorrel, same thing. But when that happened, I went to, you know, my father's blood father, and said, all right, you earned it. Now I'm going to do this for you. And so, you know, that in a sense, like, elevated his spirit, knowing that I've been able to do things to elevate him, you know. And he you know, he was a player. He was definitely a ladies' man. And, you know, he left a big old mess. And, you know, somehow my father and his brother got just tossed away, you know. But it's important that people learn as much as they can about their past. It's important that even if you don't know about them, you still acknowledge that from which you came from. Because when we do that service As we elevate, they elevate. As they elevate, we elevate.
It's kind of like a circular.
Yeah. So, we give them food. So one of the first ancestral service I did, once I did my ancestry.com thing, I went and I learned how to cook a traditional meal for every single one of my bloodlines, like old school stuff. And I'd spend an entire weekend prepping, getting things ready ahead of time, letting it sit, do its thing overnight. And then I had this massive table, all these plates of food. And then I had my plate, which had a little bit of each. Okay. And I sat there and I ate dinner with them. And I talked to them. And man, the dreams that followed that night were incredible. And so when we give them food now, when my mother was living with me, she's a living ancestor. She eats first. So I feed her first. And then I make a little small plate, just like I made myself a small plate with a little bit of each of those foods or whatever we have for dinner. And I present that to them. And I put that down with a little candle nearby. And I tell them what it is that I made. I prepare it the way I would eat it. In a lot of cases, when you make food for your ancestor, your eguns, you spice it up, you do the things to it that the way you would eat it, or the way they did. If you don't know, then you make it the way you would eat it. So when I'm making, if I have jambalaya or I have, gumbo, I'm spicing the frick out of it, lots of heat. I like a lot of heat, and that's what I give to them. And sometimes I'll still do that thing where, if I'm home by myself and I've got dinner and there ain't nobody else around, I'll sit there with my plate and I'll just sit down on the floor and what's up, y'all? This is what's going on this week. This is what's pissed me off. This is what I need help with. I got this family member that's going through this. What the hell is wrong with them? You do this for not just for yourself, but for the benefit of everybody.
So it benefits too. It's a two-way street.
Absolutely.
Awesome. I hate to say this, but we've only got 10 minutes left. So first, I want to talk about your classes for a moment here. Houngan Sen Jak, to pronounce it correctly, will be presenting these classes at HexFest. So Papa Legba, the Gatekeeper of the Spirits, Mojo Hands, a Power from the Ancestors, and Exploring the Magic of Haitian Vodou, Stories and Structure. So that all sounds just really fascinating. So come to HexFest and take classes.
It's going to be a lot of fun. I feel like some of these, the magic of Haitian Vodou is really a bunch of stories and personal eyewitness accounts, things that I've done, things that I've seen done in Haiti. There's going to be stories in there that strike the imagination in a way that people have never imagined. It's stuff that you see in fantasy. I've seen with my own eyes, So magic is just something about these cultures that have been put down the way they have, that have things that the rest of us just know nothing about. And I have seen some things that just made you go, what? Did I just see what I just saw? And but that's always a fun one. People love the stories, and I've been to Haiti more times than I can count, and I've gone just to go. And I miss going. There's a lot of things going on in the country right now that have prevented me from being able to travel there safely. But I love going just because you don't experience. There's nothing that compares to experiencing voodoo, the Loa ceremony in Haiti. Things happen in Haiti that just don't happen anywhere else and will not happen anywhere else. So that's a fun one. Legba is important because he is one of the most well-known, I believe, and there's a lot of misconceptions about him. And a lot of people kind of put him in the same pot as other spirits, which he's a separate entity, and he's very important. New Orleans, he's very well known in New Orleans, and New Orleans voodoo has a tendency to kind of clump everything together. So what I want to try to do is present this through the lens of Haitian voodoo from whence he came. Not Elegba, not Elegwa, not Eshu, not Ganesh, none of those other ones that have the same role, but not the same spirit. They're all individual. So I want to present really who he is through the lens of Haitian voodoo. Not necessarily how to serve him or how to work with him. That's something that I teach to the individual if it's for them. But I will, I want to clear up the misconceptions, the judgments. Hollywood has done a number on this poor man. You know, there's been a lot of things that have just created all kinds of, you know, things about him that just aren't true. But to really present, you know, a plain picture of him, some people are going to have or have had experiences with him, you know, and have already worked with him. In a way, this will help them fine tune their service to maybe bring it up to the next level. You know, so I'm hoping that inspires people to understand him more, to know the truths, the non-truths, you know, and to maybe learn a little bit more about him. He's that old man in our neighborhood that's been there forever, that everybody knows, that all the kids can go, you know, you can go knock on his door and say hello, introduce yourself. But again, that's a building process. You know, we don't just go set up a pretty little altar and call bam, expect him just to come through, you know. But I'm going to explain that. You know, the gree bags, again, that's something I grew up around, something I love doing. I love working with them. It's very Congo in nature. You know, it's a spirit in a bag. And the way I learned how to do it, you know, I learned at a very young age, and I've built on that based off of the people that I have come in contact with who became my mentors, you know, and I love them very much. It's a very easy thing to do. You know, if you do it correctly, you'll get maximum results. And it's similar to like a lot of the other, you know, charm bags, sachets, you know, magic bags that we do. We're all putting things in it that represent a goal. Some of those things, you know, we can even gear it towards a certain ancestor or a certain spirit we work with. So, you know, I want to give some people some ideas on how to work with that in some ways that you don't even find in a book or would find online. You know, we all got our little tricks and trades that we learned from elders that you're not going to find on the internet, you're not going to find in a book. And, you know, some of those things I want to talk about.
Great. We had a question from Joanne, and she wanted to know how to dispose of, I'm assuming, offerings, or know when to.
Hey, Joanne, how you doing, baby?
Okay.
I know Miss Joanne. You know, that depends. Depends on the spirit. You know, one thing that's foolproof is, you know, you can deposit it in nature. You know, I take nothing that's got toxic things in it. You know, I'll usually put it in like a brown paper bag, and, you know, you put that near like a tree or in a natural area that has maybe the same essence, you know, of that spirit that you're working with. You know, if you're working with something at the crossroads, obviously you're going to put something in the crossroads. You know, with Legba, you know, I have this one ancient sycamore tree that's at this one park here in Atlanta that I put his offerings at. It's right next to a creek. It's old as hell. You know, it's got that connection between like the earth and the sky, you know, that we look for, and the symbolism in the Haitian Vodou and who Legba is. He is the gatekeeper. He is, without him, we don't have no communication with the Loa. And so that bridge between heaven and earth with that massive tree that's been here a long time, that's my spot for him. You know, obviously, if you're working with the dead, you're going to put things in certain spots of the cemetery. You know, so it all depends. But oftentimes we don't deposit things on our own property because that can attract other things to your property that you may not want. There's wandering dead everywhere. In Atlanta, I have a spot, you know, because I live in a historic neighborhood. I live downtown in a historic neighborhood that's got a lot of history. I have a place outside specifically for stuff like that, that I will feed the ancestors of this land or the wandering dead, so they have a spot to go to, and they don't try to come in my house, because my house has been described as a blue med spa for the spirit world, and they will try to come through the cracks, and they have. So I have that set up out there, so it's a spot for them where they can go and they can take a little bit, and that, you know, also helps the neighborhood, the community. It empowers the spirits in this neighborhood to help keep the crime down, keep the bullshit away, keep storms from being so violent to our houses. You know, I don't just serve my Loa for myself and you know, my people. It's about the community too. You know, whether they know it or not, I'm doing the work. You know, but, you know, properly disposing of something, it's going to depend on what the work is for. If it's something that you're going to draw to you, sometimes it's necessary to bury that in the ground in your front yard. You know, if it's something that you're getting rid of, obviously you want to go away fast, you might put that in a stream that's going out, you know, or you put it in the crossroads where it can be properly flushed. You know, so it really just depends on the nature of the work and if and when there's a spirit involved.
Good to know. I want to touch on really, really quickly, and then we have to go, unfortunately, about your Botanica shop online and some of the products that you have available for people.
So some of the stuff that's there, when I was going to Haiti regularly, I was bringing back a lot of stuff, particularly Haitian supplies, because it's not always easy for them to get. A lot of the Haitian botanicas don't have websites. They old school.
Right.
You know, you got to go there. You call them, you know, good luck if they speak English, you know. So a lot of people that need, you know, the plants from Haiti. I grow a lot of the Haitian plants. I brought back cuttings and I have them growing here. Powders are a big part of our system. A lot of those tools are important, but I haven't been promoting them as much because I haven't been able to properly replenish my stock since the war is going on in the south part of Haiti. But I do offer, you know, custom made oils, candles. I need to tweak that part of my website a lot. It actually needs some love. It needs a lot of work. But because there are some things that aren't on there that I could offer. But, you know, a lot of there are products on there that are Haitian that, you know, if I have a lot of them, you know, like the powders and the herbs, if I have a lot of them, I'll still, you know, pass them on. You know, but I got a lot of Houngan and Mambo that live over here that have trouble getting those things because they don't have the same kind of connections, you know, that I have in Haiti, and they just can't get certain things, you know. So that's really where those products come from. There's some conjure products on there, like the oils I make. I love making my own oil blends, and I still have those if anyone is interested in those. I got powders. I got some herbs, but like I said, some of them I'm reluctant to part with unless, you know, if you're a priest and you know, you need, then I'll help you out. But a lot of those tools, you know, aren't as readily available for me to just replenish right now.
Right. Well, let's hope that the situation
Yes.
becomes better very, very soon.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Houngan Sen Jak.
Thank you.
Sure, and go to Hex Fest in New Orleans, August 8th through 10th, where you can hear his workshops and classes, and check out his website. Harold has put it up here a couple of times, so you can go to the website and check out what he's got on there. So this has been the Festival Fun Show here on Witchcraft TV, www.witchcrafttv.online. So I'm A.T. Fisher-Aldag, and there is Lone Wolf. Wave at us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the time. I could talk and talk and talk and talk.
I could just listen for. I had a whole bunch of other questions I wanted to ask, but it'll have to be next time. So thank you so much. And
You're welcome.
Benedictine, which is our language for blessings, and Mary Part.
Aye, boo-boo.
Y'all know about witchcrafttv.online? Been watching that the last couple days. Constantly going. I'm learning interesting stuff. And it turns out, apparently, I have a show there at midnight every night at witchcrafttv.online. Witchcrafttv.online. Check that out. I'm going to tune in at midnight and see what it is I'm doing.